Okay, good morning. So Behemshach to Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz, and going into so last week we learned the Maimer connected to that. So we started this week to go with a Maimer connected to that Frierdiker Rebbe as well. So Maimer the Rebbe delivered a unique Maimer, Yutes Tammuz, Tovshin Chav Ches, was a Farbrengen in the middle of the week, which was not common. And the Rebbe said this Maimer, Yutes Tammuz, is both the bris as well as the bar mitzvah, seventh day from the bar mitzvah of the Frierdiker Rebbe. That year, Shavasa B'Tammuz, meaning Tafresh Nun Gimel. Frierdiker Rebbe was born Tafresh Mem, so his bar mitzvah was Tafresh Nun Gimel. So that year, Shavasa B'Tammuz Nitche. So therefore, everything was pushed off a day. Bottom line is, on the Yutes Tammuz, the Rebbe Rashab said this Maimer, Behemshach to other Maimorim that he said in honor of the bar mitzvah of the Frierdiker Rebbe. It's I think all brought in the Ha'aris below. Yeah, there it says Chai Tammuz, Ha'aris 4. Chai Tammuz Yom HaShvi Yud Beis Tammuz Oyos Tainis Nitche. So the Shiva Yomim ended on Yutes Tammuz. Good. So the Rebbe said this Maimer וחזקת והיית לאיש, which is, as the Rebbe says, Maimer she'omer Admur Rashab, Rebbe Nishmos Eden b'Yom HaShvi, the Chagigas HaBar Mitzvah shel Bnei Yechide, Kvei Kedushas Meir v'Chami Admur, Frierdiker Rebbe. Yutes Tammuz, Tafresh Nun Gimel. As he says in the brackets, the original Maimer that he said in the Bar Mitzvah was Tefillin the Mora Alma, which was printed in a separate kuntris in that year, Tafresh Nun Gimel. And just looking in the footnote. 1 minute. Yeah. And they said Yud Beis Tammuz Yom HaBar Mitzvah. Okay. So we'll go over as we're doing. I'll do it by paragraph. But before I do, I want to just go over the overview of the Etzem Teichen HaMaimer. It's a pretty scholarly, deep Maimer about the three dargis Lifnei Tzimtzum. And when you learn it till the end, you don't really connect necessarily to the theme of the actual Maimer, even though these are sugis that Rebbe Rashab said in his original Maimer. So just want to point out three things he says. The three levels he talks about is really, like in general in Chassidus, whenever you want to have a mamutza, an interface, so to speak, between two dargis, like a maturgaman, so you have to have someone that knows both languages. If someone only knows Hebrew and someone only knows English, you can't translate. So he has to be able to know Hebrew, so you can translate the person who's speaking in Hebrew, and he can explain it and translate it to the person who speaks English. So Moshel and Chassidus for all mamutzayim. So if you say a mamutza, it has to have something from both. The big question is, in Chassidus, Bechlal, Kabbalah as well, is what's the mamutza between a lakus and velt? Because it's seemingly they're antithetical and opposites in every possible way. Beira, Nivra, Bli Gvul, even beyond Bli Gvul, built to Mitzias Nimtza. You know, all the Lashenas we use, everything is every possible way. The Beira and the Nivra have nothing in common, except that the Eibishter created the Nivra. However, this is the whole process of a ganzer Seder Shtalshus that the Eibishter created, and created a human being, B'Tselem Elokim, Tzalmeinu Kidmusenu. You have the Lashenas, Atzilus is Adam Elyon, Adam Elyon. You constantly find Lashenas that you see that are like a common ground, if you want a common denominator. We say, Valachta B'drochav, Mahu Chanun, Afata Chanun. Adam Kedev V'Shena, Kodesh Baruch Hu Kedev V'Shena, connect it. I mean, I can go on and on. Magid Varav L'Yakov, Chukav Mishpat L'Yisrael, Mashu Hu Oisel Mitzav L'Ases. In other words, the Eibishter created an elaborate system that connects these two realities. And B'chlolis, like in a mamutza, you need three things. You need one thing that speaks on behalf of, let's call it the Beta, so to speak. Like in the Marshal, the one who speaks Hebrew. You need something that speaks on behalf of the Nevroim that we can relate to. Because if not, then it's not a Chibur, it's not a Shutfis, it's not a Achdus. And number 3 is something that connects those two. So that's why you have the musig of number 3 so often in Teira B'chlal, especially Chassidus, Tiferes. So this is going to be a central theme here in the whole Maimer about these 3 dargas. Of course, in the highest levels, it's Lifnei Tzimtzum, but the truth is that's no madregas. So you'll always find in Chassidus, you're going to find a darga that is so-called represents the Beta, a darga that represents the Nivroim, and a darga that connects the two. Now, Kemuvon, the Eibishter's Kol Yochli doesn't need all these madregas, but we do, because we can't understand the connection based on Kol Yochli. Kol Yochli means it's Keiches Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The whole point of Dira B'Tachtenim should be also something that we're accomplishing and we understand and we relate to, or else it defeats the whole purpose. So that's why we have all these madregas, including the tzimtzum as he's going to address as well. Now, although he doesn't say it explicitly, at the end of the Maimer, when he comes back and explains the connection to the Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Rebbe Rasha being like Yaakov, and the Frierdiker Rebbe like Yosef, who's mamshich the amshachas of Eres of Atzilus of Yaakov into Biyah, you could sense basically that essentially that's really what a Rebbe is. A Rebbe is on one hand, we say, is a mamutza mechaber. Ponim v'ponim in Tofresh Nun Tes, famous Maimer, that's a mamutza mechaber, Moshe Rabbeinu, Einechem Emed Beinechem Bein Hashem Elokeichem, Chaz v'Shalom, we don't need mamutzaim, we have a direct relationship with Eibishter. But for our Aveda, we need something. So you say Moshe is a Ish Elokim. On one hand, he's a Ish, on the other hand, he's a Ish Elokim. So essentially, when you say a mamutza, that's exactly what a Rebbe is. So though the Rebbe doesn't explicitly state it, it's very much apparent when you read it between the lines, and that really makes the Maimer much geschmacked in many ways and understands the real relevance to the day Utes Tammuz, to the Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, and of course to the Rebbe. So I just wanted to put that in context before we go into the details here. So with that said, the Maimer begins. So what's the connection between וחזקת והיית לאיש to bar mitzvah b'chlal? So the Rebbe says the shaykhis is because al pi yadua d'zeh sheben sholosh esrei dafka. How do we know 13 is mechuyev mitzvahs? Because dafka then is called ish. Learned from the pasuk in Vayishlach. Does he bring the pasuk? I don't think so. Huh? But there's a pasuk in Vayishlach by Yaakov and Esav, and so we know that a person is called ish. So when we say וחזקת והיית לאיש, which means be strengthened and you become a ish, that refers to bar mitzvah. So the Rebbe asks, if b'derech hateva by 13 you become a ish, doesn't make a difference. It doesn't say if one person is more of a bar das than another. 13 years old is the shir. Every boy at 13 becomes considered an ish, apitava, is ma'ad gosh lemer v'chazakta v'yis lish. What's the v'chazakta? He becomes a ish, that's it. What's the hisofa here, the chizuk? The second question, okay, the das hu b'mechin. Especially as based on the Maimer Isa b'medrash Tilim, which he brings us to the Maimer. Actually, the Rebbe Marash's Maimer said it that I think it was the Rebbe Marash's bar mitzvah. Not sure. Look upon this is one of the Maimorim that the Frierdiker Rebbe chazed by his bar mitzvah. So the Rebbe is connecting that, and that's why we chazed that same Maimer. That's the Maimer we say. That. So what does he explain? That the bar das is in the mile of gadlus hamech. You're beginning to become mature. Before bar mitzvah, a person is a bal midas, primarily a child. That's why they don't have control. By bar mitzvah doesn't become a full bar das, but the beginning of das becomes a bar das. So why is it called ish? If you wanted mechin, it says there's Adam ish gever enish. Ish is midas. Adam is indicates on mechin. So the fact that it says v'chazak v'yisali ish, referring to the midas sheba Adam. When the chayre of bar mitzvah, the gosha should be, doesn't say clearly Adam, but why is it ish, which is midas? Okay, so we have two questions primarily. What's the v'chazakta and what is the ish, which refers to midas when the chayre bar mitzvah is connected to mech. Okay. So the Rebbe begins Siv Beis, that quoting the Maimer, the Hemshech. This is the Hemshech Tefillin Demora Alma, which is a longer Hemshech. As I said, that was the conclusion, was the last Maimer the Rebbe Rashab said 7 days later from the Bar Mitzvah and Yutes Tammuz. So he explains there the Maila of Yaakov, of Yosef over Yaakov. So B'chlolos and very Pashtus, let's put it in Balbata She'esius. Yosef was the first of all the Ovis and the Shvatim that was not just a Royet Sein. He was thrown down. It was Mitzrayim. He became first an accountant, actually. Amor the Chuzmer, they call him the first Jewish accountant of Potiphar. And then later, after he came out of prison, he became the Mishnah Lamelech in Erves Haaretz. Basically, he ran the whole agricultural department, which turned Mitzrayim into a superpower. So he was like the head of finance and trade and all that in language of our times. Now, all the others were Reyet Saint. They were shepherds. Yosef was also a shepherd till he was 17, till they sold him into slavery. So Chassidus explains why were they Reyet Saint? Because a Reyet Saint is you separate yourself from Elam Hazeh, saying they graze in the field, and the others were able to be mizbeinen and taven and connect to the Eibishter. So it was basically not precious mamish, but it was not involved in the everyday called the stock market of the time. So B'mela, they were in that level we call that Atzilus, Merkavta the Ilah. Their Inyan was Hein Heina Merkava, connected to Lakus. Yosef began his life that way, but then once he came to Mitzrayim, he had to deal with Erves Haaretz, he had to deal with Shtufi Zima, he had to deal with all the klippas of Mitzrayim, and still he maintained his connection. Varaya, when the brothers finally reunited with Yosef, he told them the remez of Egla Rufa, the Agolis, to show that he still was connected to Yaakov, even though he was in Mitzrayim. So Chassidus explains the difference is the Ovis is Atzilus, Yosef is Biyah. Yosef is Yesod of Atzilus, which is the Mashpia into Malchus. That's Minimshach in Biyah. So what does that mean? That even in Biyah, which is already Elam HaNefrodim, Alma de Pruda, not like Atzilus, Elam HaAchdus, that was the Chiddush of Yosef. He was able to be Mamshech, Elikus, even Lamata Mata, which gave, of course, the Nesinas Keach for the Aveda that would come afterwards. So I just wanted to say it in the so-called Balbata Shesi. So the Rebbe says it like this. Tam Shachasha de Yaakov hu Batzilus, Val de Yosef nimshcha Gili Gam beBiyah. The Kirogel, the Rebbe Chassidus Bechlal, realized that we learned these in Yonim elsewhere, so just wanted to elaborate. So v'yesh leimer, the Rebbe says, the Zesha b'maymed dibra masvas of וחזקת והיית לאיש medaber b'shvachis shel Yosef, shmei harishon shel abar mitzvah. So when anyone learns that Maimah, you right away see the remez, the first name of the Frierdiker of the Baal Mitzvah, which is the Frierdiker Rebbe, who gam b'chdei le'erer reisi al aveda hamyuchedes di Yosef lahamshach hagili ad lamata mata. It's in other words, why is it Negeya? Because it wasn't just the Rebbe Rashab speaking about Atzilus and Biyah. He wanted to also give Keach to his son, to the Bar Mitzvah, that he should be able to be mamshir legili ad lamata mata. I'll tell you a little Seder Cheder Abyssal. When this mind was prepared, Abiel prepared it. So I remember he was speaking with me about it. So I said to him, when he drafted it, I said to him, why are you putting this in a bracket? It's a ikar shabikar. It's like the whole, that's why it's the Bar Mitzvah. Why is the Maimah said the Bar Mitzvah is the ikar of the whole yesod of the Hemsheh, of the Maimah, really like the Kayach that the Frierdiker Rebbe would need. Remember, this is Tofresh Nun Gimel. The tzaras that would come later, connected Yud Beis Tammuz, B'chlal, the Halamas V'Steirim would become very deep. So it seems like a very sadistic thing that the Rebbe Rashab is giving Keach to his son to go through all the Halamas V'Steirim of Biyah with the Keiches of Atzilus. So, he didn't agree with me. That's why the end is like in a bracket. But I just wanted to tell you that Havamina in Torah is also Torah. Not to say my Havamina is a Havamina. I just was remember sharing that Hergish with him. But it's fine. It's regardless. It's in the Maimer. But Pashtus it's in a bracket because that negate to the Etzem Havonas HaInyan. And maybe the difference is the Haskalah of the Inyan and the so-called Aveda B'Peil. But Kaponim it's here. And And as I said in the beginning of my introduction, that's the ultimate punchline of this Maimer, despite all the Hecham Shachas and the Dargas that he talks about. So Kaponim, going back to the Maimer, the mile of Yosef over Yaakov, which usually we talk about the mile of the Ovis, but here's the Afka, the mile of Yosef. And this bracket is to give Keach to the Yosef of the Dor, the Friedrich Rebbe Ban Baal Bar Mitzvah. So to appreciate Yosef, you have to understand first Yaakov. So he goes on, I'll just sum up the rest of this paragraph. He goes on to speak about that that the Maimer explains it with the Pasuk that breaks into three parts. And here he goes into these high madregas. Mehegda mashakosov atu hu avay levadecha, ata sisa shashamayim, va'ata machayas kulam. So you have three phrases. Shem gimel madregas. This is all from the Maimer im וחזקת Tafresh Nun Gimel, and in, I think, in Phil de Morda Alma as well. Three madregas. Okay, in the footnote he has, and he brings more sources. So ata avay levadecha koi al erein sof shalifnei atzimtzum. So avay levadecha means you alone, Hashem alone. So levadecha right away indicates that there's nothing else yet in existence. Al derech when you say hoyu shmoi bulvad. So this ata avay levadecha goes on erein sof before the tzimtzum, and mufarid bezagimul inyanim. This itself is three things. Atuhu v'havaya, atuhu atzmus hamoyer. So when you say ato loshen nechach, you, that always means that it's talking about like ato reis ladas, ato du atzmus. It's talking about atzmus hamoyer. Just for the record, atzmus hamoyer doesn't always mean atzmus as we sometimes refer to bilta mitzias nimtza and those dargis, but it's atzmus hamoyer because it does call it moyer. For Emerald Ato Loshen Nechach, Ke Atzmus B'chol Mokim B'izgalus. Shem Shemayim Shoger B'Fikeil. That's what it says in Teira Eir. The fact that everybody says Baruch Hashem, Galeb Der Eibishter, even children who don't know anything, it means because there's a certain presence of Atzmus everywhere. Not B'Goli, Hamoyer Hu B'izgalus, that's the Loshen, but it means everyone's aware of it. B'Goli, I mean, you don't see it with any basar, but you're aware there's an Eibishter. All the dargis, Mispal L'Daza Atinuk, we don't know all the dargas, but that there's a neighbor that everybody knows. So that's the ata. So it's not something behelim in that sense. The second word is ata hu va'avaya hem beis madregas ba'er. The next ata hu avaya is two levels in eir. So atzmus hamoyer is ata. The two levels in eir is etzem ha'eir hu v'spashtus ha'eir havaya. I'll explain that in a minute. Ve'emer al zel levadecha she'ein kan dover zulus ha'atzmus keklos er shelifnei hatzimtzum gama er ha'shach le'elmes havaya u'kol ba'atzmus ve'ein b'chinas mitzias. Okay. So, we learned about this a little when I was teaching Ayin Beis. The big question is, how could you even say dargis lifnei hatzimtzum? When lifnei hatzimtzum, everything, like he says himself here, is hakol atzmusei. So it's all kavyochel. In Samach Vov, I think he brings it here in a footnote. He says that everything lifnei hatzimtzum is b'dargas yechelis. However, since the Eibishter wanted to give us b'chazdei hagadol some type of taste, if you wish, of how things work even under the dashboard or behind the curtain before the tzimtzum, so even though it doesn't exist yet in any way that you can call it a mitzias, but the kavyochel in the so-called elokus erein sof lifnei hatzimtzum, and this is really one of the big chidushim of Chassidus Chabad. In Kabbalah, Rizal, everything talks after the tzimtzum. You don't hear dargis lifnei hatzimtzum. Here and there, there's a remez, but Chassidus talks about it very beferish here. Right here is an example. So lefi erech, just like we say la'achar hatzimtzum, there's an element of etzem, sevav, and mamala, for example. Or in general, three dargis, like I said before. Etzem e'er, hispashtus e'er, la'atzmei, and hispashtus e'er l'zulosei. So bedakus, the dakus, kavyochel, you say the three same dargis. There's etzem hamoyer. That would be referring to the etzem, the moket itself. That's higher than giluyim. Then there's the eir, as it's legalis la'atzmei. So in other words, al derech machshava, compared to dibur. So machshava is not etzem hanefesh. So etzem hanefesh would be like ata, in the muscle in a human being. Machshava would be a levusha mechuber, it's a gilui, but only la'atzmei. Nobody else knows what you're thinking. And dibur is already a gilui l'zolose to another. So again, Kavyachol, the Al-Derech, these three Madregas exist Lamailo, and that's Atuhu Havaya. And Levadecha comes to emphasize that all this is Levadecha. Even though it's three Dargis, it's all still Kulei Asmus and Kulei Bottle and connected to the Mokir. Does he bring in the order that this is Yechelis? I think so, yeah. Order 15. The closest, if not Tzimtzum, Rak Yechelis. The Fierech after the Tzimtzum. Remember the Rebbe's letter, the Rebbe elaborates on this more to explain, but just enough said about that. Then comes the second phrase. Ata Asisos Hashamayim, what is that? That's already connected to Isavas Elimus. And that's why it says, why does it say S, Aleph Tov? It doesn't say Ata, Choser Hey. Gamma Er, Ashach Le'elimus, Havaya, Kameshu, Lifnat Simsum, Eine Berech Lias Mokel Le'elimus. So it's like the Choser Hey is Miramis that it's not yet a Moker Mamish. So apparently, and this people have asked the question, this second level seems to be the second level that he spoke about in the first phrase. So that's Taka Pshat. However, the pasuk, in other words, is meramis to two ways. One, in the first phrase, Ato Hu Havaya, is these three dargis, and more specifically, Hu would be the level of Ato Asiso, Chaser Hey, like he says, Havaya, clearly, so that's why it's Chaser Hey. Who are there? Tzimtzum shenisalim kol ha'er v'nimshach rak kav kotzer mitzumtzum v'zeu ato asisa shashamayim ato choser hey. Actually, no, I should correct myself. Based on this, the first three dargas lifnei tzimtzum is lifnei tzimtzum. Now we're saying the second phrase is going on the kav. That's makere from lifnei tzimtzum. So in other words, the kav is mushrash in the second darga in Havaya in ato Hu Havaya. That's what he's saying. So it's correct to say that it's all three in the first part of the pasuk, but specifically it's the kav. In the berach is Badeshi Moklim Zadet. In the kav Rezo Atasis Shemaim at the Chosel Hey the Zesha in Nasa Moklel and Nasis Shemaim, but they Shenechsar and Smayit at the Chosel Hey, because you need the tzimtzum, the helen, in order to create. Va'ata machayas kulam. No, you know what? I have to correct myself again. Give me a second. Well, let me just organize the dargis here. Okay, I'll go upon the third level. I'll go back to the first two in a second. The third level. So once it becomes, so it looks like he is talking about the kav, but like two levels of the kav. So he says the kav itself has two madregas. Kav is like a line, so it's short and mitzumtzum limited. Sha'ata zev ata machayim kul hu mole is basically mole, not for at like with a choser hey, mole hey kamoy ata harishin atu avayel v'dach kinyone inyan zev shabakav shu machayis kulam umitzad zeh shenimshach gilia er shalifnei atzimtzum. Okay. So the kav has two things. One is that it's lifi erech the elimus. And one is that it is ha'er shalifnei atzimtzum. So the kav has like two opposites. Where does the kav originate from? From the er lifnei atzimtzum. But it's nimshach lamato. So it has both elements to it. So va'ata machayas kulam, the last part of the phrase is the kav as it's nimshach in elimus. And the second part of the phrase, what he said, the choser hey, is the way its sherish is still so-called higher than elimus, and that's why it needs a tzimtzum to go into the state of elimus. So we have three levels here. The three levels is Bechlolis, the Etzem, like he said, the Etzem Ha'er, the Ispashtus Ha'er, but it still needs a Tzimtzum, and then the Er as it's Mitzumtzum and is Mechayas Ha'elimus. That's the three levels here. Okay. Now, as I gave my introduction, we'll understand all this now, how it all comes together. So he says, V'yesh leimer, d'zeh shemevi ba'maimer. The Lashon of that, this is what he brings in the Maimer, the Lashon from Tikkun Zeir, v'hu neviyu iyu k'nishmasa legufa. This flow of the kav is like a neshama to a guf. Meaning, we're not talking about the creation of the kelim. We're talking about the chayus of the kelim. Because we know that the neshama doesn't create the guf, and the air doesn't create the keli. It's through the air that the keli becomes created, but the keli has its own shadish. So the focus here is ata machayas kulam, and that's the Tikkun Zeir's emphasis. Inna chayas, kamoisha neshama machayas aguf. Okay. So now he says, this is the point that the kav is the third, the middle rod. So like we spoke before. Because now what you have is three dargis. Elokus, that's bechlal etzem, atahu, avaya, that's beyond existence. Completely beyond. They have oyer, that's already oyer, but it's still the ma'alim elemus. It needs a tzimtzum. So what does the kav do? The third level is mechaber. Shagam ba'elemus shenisava de'at tzimtzum. Ata chasad hey yumsha b'hem gilead and safablig will shalifnei at tzimtzum. So this is, of course, going to be the yesod of the rest of the Maimer. I'm going to get back to Yaakov and Yosef shortly. So we have now established at that point that there's three levels, and you need one to connect the two. So in many ways, the lowest level, the kav, is really has, as we're going to explain now, something that even the higher levels don't have. In other words, to come, and he's going to explain the reason for that. That's going to be the Hemshech HaMaimer. Why is that the case? So he says now, Siv Gimel. Tells you sheyesh meira sheyesh b'yisrin gam lagabe esh lifnei tzimtzum, because it's doing something that the lifnei tzimtzum couldn't do. Now Chassidus doesn't always focus on this point. This is one of the Rebbe's, I would say chidushim, but upon definitely emphasis, where he turns it around, because the fact of the matter is the whole point of Eitz Chaim that says why do you need a tzimtzum? Because Erein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum is Mamala Kol HaMetzias. Ve'ein B'einesinas Mokim Le'elam is Klal. That's why the Tzimtzum conceals it. Now that the Kav comes after the Tzimtzum and is Mamshech HaLakos, so yeah, the Kav in Giluyim is lower than the Erein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, but the mere fact that it could bring a Lakos from Lifnei Tzimtzum L'Achar Tzimtzum means it has something that the Erein Lifnei Tzimtzum didn't have. That means it's rooted somewhere even deeper. And that's what the point of this next sif is. So he says that it had to be concealed. The psalmist, you could say, okay, maybe the helam is only an Eira Gvul, the shadish of the Kav Lifnei Tzimtzum, but not an Eira Bligvul. But that's not the case. So he brings some ayin beis and other places. Let me just explain that the tzimtzum had two effects. One is that let's just give a mashal, make it easier. A teacher, a brilliant teacher, has many brilliant ideas, but if he just lets it flow without any filter, the talmidim will not be able to be makabel. So he needs to do two tzimtzumim here. One is he has to be mailim his so-called eira bligvul. He can't show his whole brilliance because that would be overwhelming. The second thing he needs to do is to be mitzamtzim his eira gvul, that it should go lefiyerach the students. So if he's going to teach them aleph beis or me'emes hakenes hashma ba'arvin or whatever it may be, so you can't just have the first helam, because the first helam is just completely so-called silencing his whole brilliant mind. So you need to have the second pool of the tzimtzum, which is that the oir should be streamed like a kav to the makabel. But bottom line is that tzimtzum affected both the eira bligvul and the eira gvul. The only thing is the eira bligvul, it didn't affect the eir itself, because the air just recedes back. It's like a person who just silences his mind. So the tzimtzum is only so-called repressing it. It's not limiting it. The second air that's going to go to the student is befedish under the effect of the tzimtzum. So basically just two different ways that tzimtzum has an impact. So bottom line is the Rebbe is bringing out here that either way, the Erein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, the Eira Gvul or Eira Bligvul, both were Nesalim. It says in some places that it says it's not master. So the answer, of course, is the Gaba Dasalian. It's not master. Bottom line is the students are both things. They're not seeing the brilliance of the teacher, and what they are seeing is a limited flow. So it doesn't matter, the guy by the teacher, of course the tzimtzum is not mastered. The teacher who's brilliant doesn't become less brilliant just because he's not being megalit. He keeps it to himself because the Talmidim would be overwhelmed by it. So that's the vart here in the bracket. So what do you see from this? That the tzimtzum, the tzimtzum befedish has power to stop it, either to repress it in era bligvul or to limit it in era gvul. Now that the kav comes and befedish is mamshech elikus, and there should be gilui, not kelem. In other words, now that the teacher is flowing, it is coming from him, from his seichel, that means there's a gilui that was not there because due to the tzimtzum that affected the era bligvul. So he says, that tells you there has to be some power this has that has a mila over the elifnei tzimtzum. Obviously, in a hagbaladik way, because it's still a kav, it's not bligvul, but it's bringing the amshach of eir that's rooted in bligvul. So as a mila, even gam ala eir habligvul. Like he explains in the Maimer, that's the nekuda, and this explains the vort why we call the kavs beikeya as tzimtzum. Beikeya is an interesting word. Soon we'll see it comes from the word Yaakov is beikeya. But what's beikeya? Beikeya means it pierces through. When something is beikeya, b'chlal, it shows that it's very intense. Shekol bekiyo mitzatik beiris. For example, one of the Moshalim Chassidus gives, if you have a barrel full of wine. Okay, so it's sealed in the barrel. But what happens if the barrel gets too full or the wine starts expanding? It pierces through, it breaks through. That's always going to be with more kayach than the wine that's in there. So therefore, the fact that the kav is bekeya shesh chatzimtzum, pnei shesherish hamshachasur l'mayla gam ha'er shalifnei hatzimtzum, higher even than the er lifnei hatzimtzum. That means it's rooted all the way in the etzem. V'yashleim rabir b'zeh. And what's the explanation? How do you explain it? The zesha er shalifnei hatzimtzum ef sheshiyave begili be'elmes shenesavim hatzimtzum pnei sha'er v'hatzimtzum em hafchim. Because the mere fact that air can be concealed means it's subject to concealment. You can't conceal something that's not shaykh to conceal. If someone will say, you could shut off the lights and this room gets dark. But for example, can you shut off seichel? And seichel, you can't shut off seichel because seichel is not subject to helam and gili. So even if the room is dark, there's still seichel in the room, just as a moshel. So the point being is the mere fact that there's a tzimtzum, eir and tzimtzum affect each other means because they're opposites. The fact that the kav, so to speak, is not nispol from the tzimtzum. What I mean not nispol, it's affected by the tzimtzum too because it comes as a kav mitzumtzum. But the fact that it is coming as eir, that tells you nimshcha gil den shlifnei tzimtzum presher shakavu mit teferes hanelam. So now the Rebbe introduces teferes hanelam from the Maimer in וחזקת. So the Kav has in it now a power that comes from higher than Chesed and Gvura. Chesed would be Gilui, Gvura would be Tzimtzum, Helam, and Teferes Hanelam is this third level, the Bria Chatichen that he said, that connects the two, and that's why it has the power to pierce through the Tzimtzum. Okay. Now the point that's important to make here, though the Kav is a narrow Kav, and it's a limited air, but it has now the power to be mamshich, all the air from lifnei tzimtzum. That will take Aveda. That's the Aveda b'zman hazeh, to so-called expand the Kav. But the etzem meaning that a Kav has entered into the realm of Elam, meaning in the world after the tzimtzum, means that there's a power, a koyach eliki, what he calls teferes hanelam, that's even stronger than the tzimtzum and stronger even than the oil lifnei tzimtzum. That's why the power to pierce through. Okay, the next paragraph, the Rebbe explains that according to this, we can explain the three phrases in the pasuk: "Atu avayladecha, atu asisa shashamayim, atu machayes kulam." That they all begin with the word "ato," because we said before, "ato neichach" is atzmus. So essentially, these three levels now, on a deeper level, is really three ways of Gilia Atzmus. Atu avayladechu Gilia ein sova bligvul da Atzmus. So nimtza b'chol mokim m'she'em ch'tzias chutz memenu. So why do you need the first level? Because that reflects the power of the Eibishter, that is Keich Ein Sof and Bligvul, that exists and nothing beyond him. Ened Movade like. Atu Avaya Levadecha. The second, that's Amshach Avatzmus and Era Bligvul. Ata Sisa Sheshamayim Ugili Keich HaGvul Sheba Atzmus HaYechoilis Shaloi Lahoyer. This is like the power of the Tzimtzum. Ulamayla Yeser Ha'inyan Demitziusim Atzmusei, which is the root of the Yesh. Sheshavah say Yesh, he says, is Agbekeicha Atzmus. So is not Megala that. Is Megala the Bligvul of Elikus, the Ispashtus. The Keicha Gvul of the Eibush is Megala the Keicha Atzmus, that is Mitzusim Atzmusi. And the third level, Ata Machayim Askulom, is the Gili Hapshitis Atzmus, She'ena Begeder, Eshena Mugde Bagdam, the Gili Vehelam, Ulchenu Mechabe Shneim Yachad, Shneim Ke'echad. Now, this is a chiddush, a pretty big chiddush, because he's saying here basically there's a level even higher than the yesh that's megala keich atzmus, because the chasson in the yesh is that it's not begili. The fact that the yesh hanivra that says in Ageres HaKedush is that we feel with ein le'ilah v'siba, because it's mushrish in atzmus that hu levade b'keicha v'yicholte, because ein le'ilah siba, because mitzjusim atzmusi v'ein le'siba ilah v'siba chaz v'shalom acheres Chaz v'shalom, shekadma lechaz v'shalom, is not begili. The yesh doesn't feel that it's keich atzmus. We're told that it's keich atzmus. The kav, the third level, he's saying now, it comes as megala. The Eibush is not mugda, not in gili era blikvul, and not in the helem of the keich atzmus in the yesh. And it basically combines that essentially keich atzmus should be begili, to put it in different aces. That's what he says here. So now that's why they all begin with the word Ata, because all of them are three dargis and Gili Atzmus. Now just to give a little, to be mamtikar a bit, I don't want to run out of time again, which we usually do, but okay. But the Rebbe once explained a beautiful idea. It makes it a little more concrete. So we all say every morning, right? Shnei ksuvim machishim zeh zeh, bo'ashel kosav ashlishi, u'machriya beineim. So the classic example of that is the two psukim that the cheder are contradict each other, that the Eibishter spoke mishnei badei ha'odin or pesach el meid. So one pasuk says mishnei badei ha'odin, that's where the voice of the Eibishter came out in the Kedesh Kadoshim, and the other says pesach el meid. So Rashi in Parsha Nosei says comes the kosav ashlishi, where he says in the end of Parsha Nosei that the voice originated mishnei badei ha'odin, and it was nimshach through Pesach El Meid. So therefore, that's a kosav ashlishi machriya beineim. It's not a stir. The Rebbe asks in his classic style, klotz kasha. What do you need three psukim for? L'chatchila, say the right way. And you don't need to have one and then have a shaila and then come to a third pasuk to be machriya. What's the kavanah here? First time the pasuk should have simply said b'loshen kotzer, the Pesach El Meid. I'm sorry, b'shnei badei ha'odin, and goes through Pesach El Meid. And the Rebbe answered, "Mamish this teichen." He said, because no, there's a mila in each pasuk, and then comes the kosav ashlishi. The mila of B'shnei Badei, because the question is also the other way around. Why do you need both things? Why can't the voice just come from one, not the other? Because you want to have that it should represent the lakus and the tarosa. It has to come B'shnei Badei from Kedesh Kadoshim. That's a lakus like Lifnei Tzimtzum, like here Eira Blugvul. If you want it to be Lifnei Erech HaNivroim, that's Pesach El Meid, because they could hear it. Klal Yisrael, Bnei Yisrael heard it. Not just Moshe. And then comes the Kosav HaShlishi, so it's the Mila of the Eira Gvul that connects to the Nivroim. And then comes the third pasuk and says the truth is you can have both Milas. The Mila of the Eira Blikvul from Shnei Badei Odin and the Mila of Eira Gvul of Pesach El Meid. I mean, it's a very practical way of applying what we just learned here. Okay.
Everything's happening. So the beginning of that is what's all that? You don't need that like the whole thing of Marla yes the world.
You're vafsich with atzmas like it's like
really hard.
Yeah, but the point is, like Keirach's mistake. If a person just knows there's a yesh anivri, yesh amiti, you could also say, I don't have to do anything. My guf chumri is atzmus mamish, I can sleep the rest of the day. So that's why, we're not talking about mitzad atzmus, we're talking about mitzad us. There's a mile in each one. You need giluyim because you need to have the gilui elikus, begoli. You need the yesh because it's megala keicha atzmus, but it's not the gili. And then you need the third level to bring both together. That's the Seder Advarim. That's why.
In other words, is there a Milo in Pelamasa that's really the Atos, or no? It's all everyone has a Milo, everyone else you can do.
If you want the full picture, the Rebbe asks a question, Chelik Hey, Vayigash, that L'cheira, since the mile is Dir B'Tachtenim, what do we need Geula for? Maybe it's only Nachas Ruach Nivra. In other words, the Eibishter, from his point, Gilui Atzmus is right now is Mana Golas, in the darkest of dark, in Tachtenim Mamish. Why Mashiach? Because the children need candies. So you give them Nachas Ruach Nivra. But Nachas Ruach Beira is much higher, is Mana Golas. And the Rebbe answers, one of the Chidushim of the Rebbe, that if Atzmus is not Begoli, there's a so-called not a Shlemus in Atzmus either. So Mashiach is not just for us. When Gilui Elikus La'asilov and Nigla Kved Hashem, Molad is Deis Hashem, is also Kavyochel, is the Shlemus of us. So in other words, the same Atzmus that created Yesh also wants that the Yesh should feel Elikus. So the answer is that it's not that's Atzmus, but the question is it Shlemus Advarim? It would be like saying, do we have the Shlemus Yafashah Achaz B'tshuva Ma'asim Tevim Be'elam Hazam Kol Chayat Olam Haba? So what do we need Elam Haba for? What do we need Chisa Mesim for? What do we need the Gula for? That's what the Rebbe addresses there. So go look there, you'll see more details. If you need more, we can talk later. I just want to, okay? Good. I'm going to go a little quicker here because I think the Chassidus was established, but still, I don't want to skip anything. So the next paragraph is why it says, Va'ata Tesvus Vov. So basically, the Tesvus Vov indicates on Tiferes, Vov, Shemacha B'shnei Avchem, the Chesed Gvura. And he goes through Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, and how each one is one of the Kavim. And ultimately, that the Vov, Tiferes, is Asius. Then he goes, okay, this is important here. Well, everything is important, but this is very negated to the beginning of the Inyan. So now he's going back to the mile of Yaakov. Yaakov is Tiferes, we know, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Yaakov is Tiferes. I think in the footnote he says he's also Faratzta. So he says, as Esis Yeboka, Yud Aleph Kuv Beis, is Esis Yeboka. Oz Yeboka Kashacher. In other words, the piercing of light, the Kav. Beikeyas Cheshachat Simsim. That's the power of Yaakov. Okay. So this is going to set the stage. What's the mile then of Yosef? We still haven't gotten back to, so if Yaakov is such a high madrega, what's Yosef going to accomplish that Yaakov didn't? Yaakov is the third level. It seems like there's even higher than that. So we'll get to that shortly. Siv Dalet. So now he goes into a shtickle, let me give just a little summary. Agdome. So in Kabbalah, Chassidus brings the Kav that came after the Tzimtzum. Where does the Kav go till? Now remember, not talking about Mokim Gashmi, obviously, it's Beruchnius. Which Madrega does the Kav reach? Now we know, you probably learned in Maimorim and Chassidus, the Rebbe Sichos as well, that the Kav can't go all the way down to the other end of the Tzimtzum. In other words, the end of the Chol, rather. Because if it goes down, it loses the power of Milo Mata. It says, the Kav will go all the way down. So if you use a visual Gashmi as the commercial, the Kav, the Chol Mokim Ponim is like a hole. The Kav enters like a flow, but it can't go all the way down. So it goes down, I'm not going to say 3/4, it says Mistayem is Batzilus. And after that, it's only a reflection of the Kav, not the Kav itself. So he explains in the Maimer וחזקת, or is it? Yeah. He says, the Zeshe Yaakov, Esis Yeboka, Kis HaKav, Ubriach HaTichin, HaMavriach Min HaKotza LaKotza, is referring to what's Kotza LaKotza from one end to the other. So So Kseh Shemaim Delatata is the end of Atzilus. And where's it originate? But then, where's it originate would be from Kseh Elyon would be the Lifnei Tzimtzum. But then he says, since the Kav Yaakov is not going into Biyah, it only goes to Atzilus, so something is missing. The Hamshach of the Kav also even into Biyah. We already accomplished that it pierced the Tzimtzum. But what about Biyah? That's Yosef. Yosef was shalit ala oretz. Because Yosef went into Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is of course, in the El Mahaza, it's the worst, the lowest of the low. But in Ruchnius is like Biyah, and he was Megala Lakuz Biyah. And that's why it says, Eila tel this Yaakov Yosef. Why is Yosef Taka the one that Yaakov so-called favored? So it says, the Yosef Mamshech HaGelim the Yaakov Sheyeiru Bibiyah. Val derech ha'hefresh bein ha'ovis and Matan Torah, Yosef is shaykh to Matan Torah. The ovis in general was still in Atzilus there, Aveda, and Matan Torah, it was Nimshach in Biyah. So al derech zeh Yosef is like the Matan Torah compared to the Atzilus of Biyah, the Matan Torah Lamata compared to the Atzilus of the Ovis. And that's what he says, Mazeh v'hine mazeh, she'omar ba'maymer she'yosef mamshech ha'giluim di Yaakov she'ira b'biyah mashma, the zeh she'yosef mamshech ha'giluim b'biyah lefi she'yosef who tailed this Yaakov. In other words, it's not because he had a separate kayach. It's taka coming from Yaakov itself. That due to the Bekiah, which means that it comes from a place that there's no Hagbolus. It pierces everything, ultimately has the power to go into Biyah. However, Begilui, El Shein said Yaakov is Gala Yosef. So it's not like Yaakov is one level, Yosef is another level. Yosef took the Pnimius and Etzem of Yaakov and brought it all the way into Biyah. But Yuvan Zeh al Piyah Yedua, the Rebbe explains it now. What's the reason that the Kav so-called ends, the Kav itself ends in Atzilus? Why couldn't the Kav continue? Because if it would, you wouldn't have the Nivroim to be real Kalim. You have to create a certain more distance, so to speak. So he says, so Shabibi Slapshus Ha'er Yechel Yisrak Binyonim Kalim Shem Elikus. In other words, you need to have the Eir HaSeviv, the Eir HaBlikvul, to be able to bring it down lower. If the Eir HaKav was Begoli, it would not be an Eifon of Islapshus. Because Eir HaBlikvul, because the Eir HaBlikvul always remains removed from existence. So Ein HaTzimtzum Mastir. Remember, Mastir here doesn't mean that it's not concealed from us. It means, but the Etzem HaEir remains not Mitzumtzum. So, Hu Meir Begili Gam La'achar HaTzimtzum B'chol Mokim Gam B'biyah Al Shazor Rak B'diyosei Yisbarach, like he said earlier. U'ba'elam es ein zeh nirgish, Kanal Siv Gimel, V'adei Shemeir Ba'akav Ma'er Shalifnei HaTzimtzum Nasa Gam Akav B'efen Gazeh, Shazehu Nimshach Mizgal Gam B'biyah. Okay. So bottom line is that you need to have two things going on. Remember, the Kav, Chassidus explains, as it travels downward, it gets diminished, like any Eir, like the Eir HaShemesh. The Eir HaSun, the sunlight, when it's close to the sun, is much more powerful than when it's down here. But if we had the sunlight the way it's there, down here, it would burn up the whole world. So the Kav too has to go through Helamis in order to be able to nislabish to each level. Or else every level would be Atzilus, or even higher than Atzilus. So to have that very Elam as Biyah, you need a Kav that's going to be subject to these concealments. However, remember the Kav carries a powerful Eir that comes from Lifnei Tzimtzum and even higher than all the highest levels from Tuferes Hanelam. So, but that's all still concealed in the Kav. That's why the Kav is not Mevat Le'elamis. But it's in there. It's embedded in there. So B'meila, the Kav has it both elements. That's essentially the difference between Yaakov and Yosef. Yaakov, the Kav, is more Begoli, and that's why it pierces the higher levels. In Yosef, the Kav is now going into Biyah, so it doesn't quite have Begiluyim quite the power, but it has the power to bring Yaakov, the highest levels, all the way down below. And now we complain, that's the difference between the Bekiah of Yaakov and the Bekiah commission is Gala de Yosef. What's the difference between Yaakov within Yaakov and Yaakov within Yosef, basically? Shabigir de Yaakov mitzad atzmei who preaches a bit like Darim the Gili with Simpson. Yaakov essentially breaks through the pshittus of everything, that nothing is mugdir. In other words, Yaakov was mamshir the etzem inyan that even after a tzimtzum you could have the highest giluyim, but you still have the limits of gilui. The fact that the teacher, for example, can convey aleph beis to a student is a great chiddush, but it's still aleph beis, still a limited gilui. So where in the world of giluyim do you have a yibaka? That's what you need. So that's what he says. So that's why the commission is God. Yosef who preaches a bitl gam da agdorim shebe'inyan agili gufa. In other words, not just that the etzem is there in Helam, but also that in Giluyim itself, you could also ultimately experience even the highest levels of Yaakov and so on. Now, the truth is, this needs a lot of explanation. Because the Chayra, till now, we learned that's what Yaakov accomplished. The third level accomplished the Chibur of Era Bligvul and Era Gvul. And the third level that reaches a level that you could have the Era Lifnei Tzimtzum, Lacharat Tzimtzum. But yet, here, the diuk here is that in the world of Gili, that's the problem. You asked before about the Etzem Hayesh. Fine, to say, for example, Eid has an Etzem and Neshama, it's a Chidush. But can that Etzem and Neshama also come out the Goli? Or it remains always in an Etzem Atzmizdika level? So as long as you only had Yaakov and Atzilus, you couldn't know the answer to that. Because in Atzilus, there's Gili. How do you know that you come to a world of Biyah? Or let's put it in Balabata Shesis, in the world of Mitzrayim, Erves HaOretz. Can you also have these high Giluyim? The answer is absolutely, and Yosef demonstrates that. That even in a world where there's Mamash Helam, and the world of Giluyim, where there's no Gilui, even there you could be Mamshir, the Keyach of Yaakov. But it's still Yaakov. I mean, to put it in the aces of the Rabbeim, the Frierdiker Rebbe, much as the Nisyanis that Rebbe Rashab went through, the Frierdiker Rebbe went through much harder challenges. That's why when the Nisiyas began, the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rebbe Rashab, and the Frierdiker Rebbe asked it should be Bechesed Berachamim, Yidua, because the tzaras that would go through, the Rebbe Rashab was not arrested and almost killed like the Rebbe Frierdiker Rebbe and all the other Helamas. So the truth is, it comes from the same Keyach Chassidus of the Rebbe Rashab, of Yaakov. But Bapel Mamish, where do you see that it really became a dover that you saw by Pashtus and Yud Beis Tammuz, was dafka through the Frierdiker Rebbe in Yosef. That's somewhat of an explanation on what he's saying here. What's the difference between Yaakov and Yosef, or between Yaakov himself?
Between Yaakov, which is the Chaber, and Bligvul itself, which is also giving
Bligvul, basically it's like saying what was the difference between having a tzimtzum without a kav and a tzimtzum with a kav. The tzimtzum without a kav, you still have the Era Bligvul, but it's behela. The kav brings a gili into the yibaka, means there's a gili. Yaakov brings gili. If without Yaakov, you only have a Era Bligvul, lifnei tzimtzum. The tzimtzum conceals it. So the Gabi Diyase is Baruch, everything's b'shlemus. But the Gabi Yudiyasenu, the tzimtzum is a helam gomer. There's no gili. In Biyah, he's not begili. But he's begili in the Elamis, not Silas is begili. In other words, there is a gili alakus now in the state of Shtalshus. The question is if it's going also into a world of Biyah. So he says two things. It comes from the power of Yaakov, but Yosef brings a Bapel Mamish. Okay. I mean, I'd like to finish the whole Maimon, but I don't want to rush it also. Maybe what we do is maybe on Monday I'll just finish it. How about that? I need the permission of the Anholas Kale. Does it make sense? Because I see I didn't get, I can start rushing through it, but there's still pieces. You fill in Yaakov and Yosef and then the end. You know what? On Monday I'll finish it. Okay, so we'll stop here. We'll do it in two parts. Where am I stopping? At the end of Siv Dalet. Okay, good. Huh?